Good morning, everyone, and very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining this breakout session in which we'll be exploring how you can help your boards to recognise value in your compliance programme. By way of introductions, my name's Andrew Breakwell. I'm a Commercial Director at EQS Group in the UK, where we provide a range of digital compliance solutions to organisations of all sizes. And I'm really pleased to be joined today by three experts who bring with them a breadth of knowledge and practical experience in this area. So perhaps I could start by introducing Manu Hanspal. Manu is head of EMEA for the Association of Corporate Investigators. He's worked in law enforcement and corporate investigations across a range of sectors and brings a keen understanding of the operational challenges and elements required for those conducting investigations. Next, we have Annabel Kerley. Annabel is a partner with the global advisory firm Stone Turn. She's also an advisory panel member of the ACI. Annabel specialised in audit, forensic accounting, investigations and compliance and monitoring for over 20 years. And finally, we have Rachel Pinckheard, who's Group Internal Audit Manager for FEXCO, which is a multinational financial services and financial technology company headquartered in Ireland. Rachel's role involves working with regulated and non-regulated businesses in identifying and monitoring fraud risks, developing effective fraud prevention strategies, and leading fraud investigations. So as you can see, we have three expertly qualified speakers with us today, so I'm sure we'll have an interesting and engaging discussion. And we'd really welcome your input and participation as well. So we've allowed time towards the end of this session to address any questions you may have. As any questions or comments come to mind throughout the discussion, please enter them into the panel to the side of the screen, and we'll get to as many of these as we can as possible after the main discussion. Just one other point. As you can see, we're clearly not all in the same room today, and so whilst we don't envisage any technical difficulties, you never know. So if there are any, please bear with us, and we'll resolve them as soon as possible. So to start off with, we'd like to present a poll question to you, to which we'd like you to respond, and we'll then come back and address this later in the session. So in a second, you'll see the question hopefully appearing on your screen, and I'll allow you sort of 30 seconds or so to respond. Pregnant pause while this appears, hopefully. If it doesn't, we'll present it later and come back to it. No, okay, best laid plans. So we'll come back and we'll present that poll question a little later in the session. So I think we'll start by maybe I could ask a question to you first, Rachel. And the first question is, what should we measure in compliance and why? So I don't know if you could explain what you currently do within FEXCO, and then maybe Manu and Annabel could share some of their models and approaches that they've experienced.
Some of this, thanks Andrew, some of this depends on the size or the type of the company. So if a company is regulated, there will naturally be more obligations or additional measures that would be put in place. So the starting point, I think, for any company is to make sure that they have a compliance framework in place and that they have established what their compliance universe looks like. So that's a list of all their industry and regulatory obligations that they're obliged to comply with, and to have done some element of risk assessment on them, so that then the compliance teams can come up with their annual compliance oversight and monitoring plan, which would then guide what is being measured and why. So, for example, if you were to take whistleblowing as one element of compliance reporting, what would you measure there and why would you measure it? You measure the number of issues that tend to come up and what type they are. If it's continuously a data protection issue that is being raised, maybe you have a level of training that needs to be done. You'd also look at substantiation rates. You need to know whether people are making accurate reports or whether it's being used inappropriately. The materiality of what's raised in terms of if it was a fraud, the potential impact of it, and whether it's a repeat issue. It might have a low cost But if it's a repeat issue, that can be problematic. And again, you need to look at your controls in place then and educating people. The relevance to other areas within your business, it could come up in one particular area, but again, it could have a knock-on effect in if an issue comes up in IT, it could have a knock-on effect on your business units. And you need to consider the fact that, is it an issue that has to be reported to external stakeholders? And again, if it's a repeat issue, you need to be conscious, if you're repeatedly contacting a supervisory authority, that you're pinging them the whole time with bad news. And again, time and cost of investigation. Was it worth the investigation, and what were the lessons learned and any follow-up work that should be done? I think, that's in terms of whistleblowing, but also any kind of, from a compliance point of view, I think we have started looking at near misses over a period, and I think that is very useful, because with the move to remote working, and we're very conscious of social engineering and phishing. So we've ran a number of phishing exercises, and also anyone who has been successfully contacted by someone phishing, but the funds haven't been released, we've done a lessons learned on that, where even if they didn't proceed, we can share the learnings from that.
Thanks, Rachel. Manu, what are your experiences in this area around measurement? What to measure and why?
I think one way to take a step back from this is to say what is the purpose of your program, and if you've got a very defined strategy, one that I've been quite clear and I think resonates is the overall goal is to prevent, detect and respond. So from an investigations perspective and whistleblowing perspective, where does that sit? So investigations lead to outcomes. Those outcomes then share their learnings. Those learnings then help the business prevent something from happening. And then also empowers the business to then detect. Okay, we know now what to look for, and we can stop these things from happening, and we can detect when wrongdoing occurs. And then obviously responding is your investigations function. So how well does your investigation function do those three things? I think those are good things to have. But I think measuring more from an investigations point of view, I think conventional thinking always goes straight to substantiation rates. And I would like to think a little bit differently to that, because from a practitioner point of view, and purely investigations, I think it's kind of a flawed way to think purely on substantiation alone, because that's just an outcome. The outcome is resultant of your conduct and activity in an investigation. And what if that activity leads to something being unsubstantiated? So that doesn't mean the investigation is flawed. It just means that if all reasonable lines of inquiry have led to a matter being unsubstantiated, that doesn't necessarily mean your investigation is ineffective. So I think that's only but one measure. So what I've seen and what I've worked on is a combination of factors, which is your case aging, your substantiation, yes, the type of issues that are being raised, and this then speaks to your broader awareness. So if you're seeing more matters of substance coming through, and substantiation rates increasing, and case aging reducing, what you start to see is more effective investigations. What I've also done before is a real proponent on reporter management. Your reporters are so key in investigations. You wouldn't know that this is occurring unless someone took the brave step and reports it. So that's a different conversation altogether. But if your investigations program or your compliance program is able to show high reporting rates and more things of substance, and your reporters are engaged and you're measuring and tracking that engagement, which can be done, and then that translates into higher substantiation rates, what you're starting to see there is a very effective picture of a program. People are trusting the program, they're reporting things of substance because they know what's wrong, and they're trusting the program, they're engaging with your investigators, and then your substantiation is increasing. And also across all of that is harnessing technology, being able to, particularly in a remote setting, those quick check and verify exercises, engaging with your reporters, tell me where the information is, where do I look? I've found, particularly over the last over the pandemic, being able to conduct effective investigations in a real timely way, in a real pointed way, I think is a really good measure that demonstrates value in the programme.
Thanks, really helpful advice. Annabel?
Thanks, Andrew. Excuse me. So, I mean, just building on the basics that Rachel went through, and then Manu's comments around how you can combine information to give you more insight into what's going on. I think another way I would add to look at things is by drilling down into some of the headline numbers and information that you're gathering, and understanding, for example, say if you take just number of reports, how can you break that down into number of reports via which means of communication? So was it through the official speak up line? Was it to a line manager? Was it outside of the system somehow? Was it made externally? And then think about what that further information can give you in terms of insight into your culture and whether people trust the system. So you're getting a high volume of reports outside formal channels, you might need to have a look at the training and the perhaps raising awareness and trying to build more trust in the system. I think as well, coming on to substantiation rates, I think it's a fascinating topic, and we could probably spend the whole session talking about those and debating the use or otherwise. I would suggest there that it's quite interesting, again, to break those down and look at some qualitative data around that as well, and look at reasons for substantiation or non-substantiation. So was there a lack of evidence? Was the report withdrawn? What are the reasons for the substantiation rates? And one other thing would be to also, and I know we'll come on to this in more detail when we talk about benchmarking, but just to think about the context. You can't really look at any of these in a vacuum. As Richard said, you need to know what the industry sort of averages, or normal, and also what normal is for your company, because otherwise you're just looking at numbers in a vacuum. They can be meaningless in that regard.
Thanks, Annabel. I'm just looking at one of the questions that's been asked. We've talked a lot just in this first question around investigations and incidents as measurement elements. But what about the broader element of measuring, compliance more generally above and beyond the investigative aspect?
If I can start off, and the others can jump in. Again, I think if you put together a compliance risk register, and you look at what controls you have in place, and you can use that for a communication device with management. Compliance doesn't operate in isolation. Yes, you need a level of independence and a bit of separation in terms of roles, but you also need management input to fully understand what your business processes are, what the risks are, and in terms of industry knowledge, often management can help with that. They can provide insight. They're also horizon scanning. They're also watching what's coming down the track, both from a regulatory and industry point of view, and they're dealing with their peers. And it is, as Manu said, prevent, detect, respond. You are looking to prevent issues arising rather than having to deal with them at a later date.
Manu and Annabel, anything to add?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on, Rachel. I think it's a really interesting question. And I think one of the things I would say is that it comes also down to lessons learned and feeding those back in at the end of an investigation into your systems and controls. Obviously, there are debates around lessons learned, and it needs to be well anonymised and generalised, especially in a smaller organisation, because there's then a risk that people will sort of know more things than they should about what's gone on. So that's one aspect. So it's making sure to demonstrate value, you should actually over time be getting fewer reports and fewer investigations, because you are feeding back your lessons learned into your overall compliance programme. And I think just on the horizon scanning point, I've seen more and more clients using lots of disparate sets of data to pull them together and then sort of risk scan and identify potential issues. So, for example, you could pull together staff attrition rate, consider the transparency international risk of a geography, and then look at the level of whistleblowing reports in that area. If the first two are high and the third is low, that might identify something that you go and look at and see what's going on there. I've also seen in the financial services context, again, where lots of disparate data around unauthorised trading was all brought into one place. Management time away, building access data, council changed amends on orders, and P&L data for individual traders. That was all fed in, and then it was being used pretty effectively, actually, to identify early on potential instances of unauthorised trading, and that was heading off issues before they happened.
So Annabel, you've mentioned you've begun to move into the next topic I wanted to discuss about how data can best be gathered to enable this measurement. So you've just mentioned some specific elements in the financial services that you've used as measurement tools. Can we explore amongst the three of you, how best to gather data to feed into the reports that you may make to the board? Just before I do that, it was my mistake on the earlier poll question. It's a button on the top right hand of the screen where you'll see the poll. So we've got answers coming in, so we'll deal with those a little later on. Apologies for that. And just a reminder as well, please continue to enter your questions and answers, questions into the panel, and we'll get to them later. But can we talk a little bit more about the data gathering component?
I suppose to kick that off, a lot of systems nowadays have the capability, in terms of flagging transactions, to be moved to compliance queue to review, from an AML point of view. But as like Annabel said, I think it's also worth reaching out to different departments. If there's a data privacy officer in place in your organization, they will be collating a report. Now, they may be submitting that independently to a board, but if you're a compliance officer for a particular area within a business, or you're the group compliance officer, it would also be relevant to get that information from them. In terms of, have there been many requests for the right to be forgotten or subject assets requests? Those are all useful things to include from a compliance point of view. And again, training metrics from L&D, from your learning and development team, are useful. You want to make sure that if there's been new employees onboarded, that they have received all the up-to-date training, or if there's annual requirements for training. If you're a regulated entity, you might be required to complete annual AML training, and that is, it may seem like a check the box, but it's an important one to be able to demonstrate that your staff are fully up to date with the most recent requirements. I think they would be my main ones.
Manu? Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Rachel. I think from my perspective, sort of speaking to my expertise more than anything else in investigations and building out an investigations program that can, almost justify its existence and say this is the value, this is the return on it, and therefore how that feeds into your broader compliance program. What I've found great success is just thinking a little bit differently, looking at it from a cultural perspective. So looking at your data and what you select on your platform as a means to draw information in. So on platforms that I've seen, there's particular questions when people report concerns, and one of those points could be adapted, and there's a really interesting data point, and it gives you great means to conduct analysis. And one of them that I've seen is, have you raised this report to management prior to the platform? Now, again, I'm a big proponent of not having too many survey questions because you want the interface to be quite seamless, but it's a really powerful question. And when we report value to the board, I've certainly used that to great effect because it's giving them something that they might not get from any other data source. It's telling them something that actually, I've tried to report this internally and nothing's happened. I've tried to report to management, but I trust your program enough to report it again. And then when you start seeing substantiation rates and everything I discussed before, what you're seeing is that trend. People are coming with matters of substance, they're trying to raise them to management, and they're either, you know, without going into all the details, they're dismissed, they're ignored, the response is lackluster, they're not listened to. You know, speak up is also about listening as well. So I think how you frame that data, how you can isolate that to speak to a certain region, I think that takes you off in a completely different direction around culture, behavior, and you can start overlaying that with your sites, your regions. You know, what regions from a geographical perspective either have more reports, but their management are more in tune, and how does that relate? So I think there's lots of directions you can take it if you're willing to think just a little bit differently, and also think of the audience. What do the board really want to know? So they really want to know, well, I've had 20 reports in this region, or actually, are you taking a deeper dive in and really providing meaningful insights? And that's what I found great success in, just putting a little chapter. And I can talk about, you know, profiling as well, where I've created profiles of wrongdoers. So looking at the data that you can amass through investigations, you're actually feeding back in to say, well, this is what a wrongdoer looks like in the company. They're of a certain disposition, they're a certain gender, they're a certain age, they have certain delegations of authority, and before you know it, you can pinpoint, you know, who's going to be the fraudster. And I find it quite humorous actually in it as an engagement tool. You know, everyone stand up if you have this level of authority, or sit down if you have this, and whoever's remaining, well, statistically speaking, you're going to commit a fraud soon. It's quite a funny enterprise, but it's just something to do. But that's what you can do with this data. So I like to think a bit differently, be a bit daring, and if you tweak and change some of the measures that you have, you'll be surprised what data and analysis you can do at the back end. And I think it's a much better means to give information to the board.
I agree with Manu in terms of, I don't know if I agree with pinpointing someone that I expect that they're going to be a fraudster, but I agree with Manu that there is a lot of data out there that you could potentially use. And I think that's important. You know, if you have an area, you know, where there's a fraud that has taken place, and you look at it, and when you look at the lessons learned, you know, as in you look at what was the root cause of this issue, like how did it happen? Was it simply, you know, someone voiding a transaction and putting in a transaction later for a lower rate, you know, we'll say in a bureau business, and pocketing the difference? So then you can establish, you know, kind of key risk indicators. You can put in controls like, monitoring reports like checking for the number of voided transactions in a store, the frequency of a transaction. You know, if you're doing from an AML point of view, you can look at how many times transactions went through in less than a minute, which could indicate that, you know, rather than going over the threshold, the cashier has said, do you know what, I'll split it in two, and then you don't have to provide the documents. So if you look at transactions that have gone in less than 2 minutes, that could be an indicator that something amiss. You know, now it could be just a speedy cashier, or you could have, but it makes it worth the visit. And again, it's back to that preventing rather than detecting, you know, and closing that loop, because we have masses of data, and it just makes sense to use it.
Yeah, I think just building on Rachel's point, I think it's really interesting. I know in the insurance industry, more and more the metadata around forms and systems is being used. And one really interesting one is around the time it takes for people to fill in an online form making a claim for insurance. And it's been shown that the longer it takes, the more likely the claim is to be fraudulent, because someone is having to, you know, they're not just remembering the facts of what happened, they're fabricating and embellishing, and that takes more time to process and then put into a form.
That's interesting.
So thanks for that. If we move on to the next thing, and maybe we can have a quick look at the poll question as well now. But we all know that it can sometimes be quite difficult to engage the board's attention, no matter what you're trying to communicate to them. So I'd like to explore with you, in your experience, you know, how should information be presented to the board, you know, to best get their attention and focus on the compliance and investigative issues that you're trying to communicate to them. Just briefly though, if you're looking at the poll on screen now by clicking on the poll button, I think the good thing, one thing I would pull out of this is the good thing to note is that everybody, almost everybody, apart from 1.8%, is communicating on compliance to the board in a formal way, and most commonly people are communicating quarterly, some monthly, some less frequently. But I think it's a positive feedback to see that there is regular formal reporting. Any comments on the poll itself from any of you before we look at, explore the topic of how to present information to the board?
I think it's a really interesting result, actually. I would have actually expected not to have such a high proportion of people reporting quarterly. I think that's great. I don't think we know the sector split of the audience. That would be an interesting thing to overlay this data, but yeah, it's good that only 1.8% never report. Any other thoughts, Manu, Rachel?
I would have said that we are at a conference, so I would assume that most people here have experience, and it is, it's the SMEs sometimes that you need to be concerned about, because they may not have the ability to do the things that we're talking about, like developing a compliance framework, putting together a compliance plan. They're focused on running their business, whereas any of the larger organizations, you would expect that they would have someone appointed to compliance and have that level of formality. So I think it's a positive thing, definitely. It can only be good that people are making regular reports to the board, but I suppose conscious of the audience that we're with.
Slightly skewed poll, perhaps.
Maybe.
Manu, what are your thoughts on how to engage the board, how to present this information to them?
Yeah, I've had this specific challenge, and I've tried something a little bit different, and it got positively received. Insofar, again, just shaping it more to from a whistleblower investigations program perspective, because that's my expertise, and how that fitted into a larger quarterly or even yearly compliance kind of roundup to the board. But we kind of changed it to reflect it was like a compliance self-assessment. So we inverted the reporting format and said, right, these are the questions I'd be asking to test whether my program is actually working. And there was just a series of questions in the document to say, how do you test this? What if this occurs? How do you deal with that challenge? And it was kind of like a mini self-assessment, and then use that as a means to justify and say, well, yes, that's a challenge, and this is how we've overcome it. And it was just an interesting way, and we had great feedback, and it was a better way to engage and receive feedback and commentary. And also, allowing your metrics to develop is another thing. Reporting for reporting's sake, in my view, just gets very dull, and you're not taking anything from it. So you do need to present something different, and you need to allow trends to develop. So from an investigations perspective, not so much quarterly, but I think when was the last time I turned it in? I think it was at least allowing a good 6 months to develop before we had a first cut of the data. But behaviours of our subjects, behaviours developed through whistleblowing, and that was talking about opportunity, capability, motivation, incentive, and rationalization of wrongdoers or outcomes of investigations. And that then created another means to present really good data to the board in an engaging way. Now, this is the behavior that's being displayed as a result of wrongdoing, because these are the four elements. I think it's the Wolf and Hermansen fraud dynamic, but I applied it as a broader wrongdoing dynamic, knowing that when I'm interviewing a subject, for example, there's always the incentive or motivation that drove them. There's possibility of a capability aspect. How were they able to do this? What opportunity was developed? Did something happen externally or internally where I thought, right, this is the time to do it? Is it a process or control issue? And that's where the opportunity develops. And then the rationalization, the why. What do I tell myself that this is okay to do? That was much better way of presenting that information to the board, and they really understood the profiling aspect. And we then, as I touched on before, feed that back into the business and say, this is how wrongdoing, this is how subjects are behaving. So then you can start looking at risk to role training. You know, there's a capability question here. There is parts of the business or parts of the organization where the controls are such that it creates an opportunity gap or a capability gap. We have far too many super users with no other checks and balances. And here's a statistic readout of how many cases where that factor was the overriding one, which meant that led to a substantiated business integrity wrongdoing. So in some way of doing that data, thinking a bit differently, you can then really point your resources, you know, resources to risk. And then if that translates into the means by you report to your board, you're really seeing this growing trend of you know, really good work. You know, you're building a compliance program, you're understanding the behaviors, it's being driven by data. This is how many cases have occurred in a particular region. These are the behaviors, and we're directing training at that location, at that demographic per se. And I think we put all that together, but that takes time to develop. So after a year or so, all these processes came together. So that's how I think you should really, really present the effectiveness of your program. It's really less about all these statistics and programmatic elements. I think it's about the culture, and you can see how it's changing, because the next year you might have less incidents, you might have less opportunity because you've closed those gaps. So it's going to take time, I would advise. It takes time and to get your organization and reporting and structures to that kind of maturity, but I think it makes for a much better exercise and it's much more meaningful.
Annabel, what's worked in your experience, and what are your thoughts on what Manu's said?
Yeah, I think Manu's absolutely right. I mean, I think one thing you could do is ask the board what they would find useful to see. And I think, you know, these days there's many dashboards and scorecards and visualization tools that can really help you present your data board in a meaningful way. One thing, and this is the accountant in me speaking out, that I would try and include would be some sort of, and this goes back actually to what Rachel was saying right at the beginning, to time and effort versus you know, potential impact. I would try and incorporate, and this is going to be very organization specific, some kind of cost benefit analysis into your reporting. So, you know, how long did it take? What level of staff were used? What detraction was there from business as usual for those staff versus what was potentially the cost avoided? Were you facing a regulatory fine? Was there any recovery made in a financial fraud type case? You know, did you get any assets and money back from the perpetrator? And then this is needs more work, hard to quantify, but what reputational detriment or risk have you avoided?
Rachel, have you used these techniques within FEXCO? How do you present to the board?
We use numbers and metrics a lot. I agree that graphs and visual, where possible, are very useful. We have found that now, it depends on what your board is looking for, but our non-execs are very interested in the detail, and which is a great thing, but I think it's important to kind of overlay with a summary where possible. So, you know, if you were to take a quarterly report from a business area, you would be looking at what their compliance universe is. So what regulation and industry standards are they subject to? And if there was something like AML, it would be the number of suspicious transactions that came up in the quarter since the last committee meeting, and how many of those were, you know, escalated, reported onwards. And you would, you know, like Manu said, trend analysis is always very effective, even if it is, you know, you can't compare year on year. If you can compare quarter on quarter, it's useful. Or if you have, if you can break it down into the detail. Now, I'm not saying that this would necessarily go to a board, but if a large number of suspicious transactions are arising from one particular store, if you had a number of shops, we'll say, and whereas not so many, or that one particular employee was raising an awful lot of issues and that others weren't, there might be a training element. you know, maybe other people need to be brought up to speed, or maybe that person is overly cautious. So it's to investigate those matters. But in terms of presenting to the board, again, where you can kind of make it digestible, visual, I think that really helps. And definitely the comparative quarter on quarter, year on year, if needs be. And where possible, if you can compare to an external source, that would be good.
So there's a question that's been asked. I think we'll deal with this now as it's relevant to what we're talking about by Krupa Ved. Apologies if I've not pronounced your name wrong, right. But what are the topics that must be included in periodic compliance reports, and how can that regular report be made more interesting? I think we've answered the second part of that question, but what are the must-haves in any regular compliance report to the board?
I would say, sorry, I'm jumping in, but I would say that what has to be included, it depends on your compliance universe, and that sounds vague, but it depends on what regulation you're subject to. You know, most areas, like, sorry, everyone is subject to GDPR if they're processing personal data. So if that's the case, that would be listed. You know, you can work out your headings that must be included, you know, in terms of your compliance framework. So you would have a number of areas that would be, and I think breaches of internal policy are useful to include, because again, like Manu said, that goes towards the culture of the organization. So if you have a lot of breaches of internal policies, that should be reported. But other than that, it depends what your compliance risks are. So you've got, you know, AML, GDPR, you might have some kind of industry certification, just to provide an update that you've maintained that. It really, yeah, it depends on what your compliance universe is. Sorry. Is that?
Manu and Annabel, any must-haves from you that we haven't already touched upon?
No, I think Rachel's covered it pretty comprehensively.
So Rachel, you mentioned benchmarking and the importance of benchmarking. Let's move on and talk about that as a question. So benchmarking your performance is generally an important element in comparing your internal situation with that of your peer group companies. So how do each of you recommend that you go about benchmarking your compliance data? Who'd like to pick this up? Rachel?
Sorry.
Carry on.
I think it can be a hard thing to do, in that it sometimes, you know, if you have a, you know, we'll say you could take something internally, you know, by department, where you're looking at a volume of cases as a percentage of employees. But I think most boards really like that external in viewpoint, where, you know, it's like, how are we doing amongst our peers is very useful. And I think a lot of the times you can make queries of your external auditors, or if you've an outsourced internal audit provider. We have done a number of reviews recently, which are kind of maturity assessment reviews. So you're taking something like cyber risk or GDPR and saying, how mature is our organization in relation to that? And you know, if you're using one of the big four, again, you know, it depends on the size and type of your organization. They do have access to databases that can provide comparisons. Other than that, you know, I think there is advantages to being part of networking groups where you're discussing with your peers what their experience is, so that even if you can't formally say, you know, typically 4% of phishing exercises are, you know, people click on the link, and that's pretty much an industry standard. You might find that out by literally Googling, or you might be asking your peers and saying, you know, if you do phishing exercises, are many people failing it? So I think there are, it's a multi-layered one, in that you can get the formal information from kind of big four accountancy firms, or from publications on fraud statistics, etc., that are available online. But it's in order to get the real value, even if you get informal feedback from your peers, that's very useful.
Manu?
Yeah, just a very specific sort of pointed note from me. So from an investigations perspective to bore everyone again, I've used that to good effect to show the effectiveness of that program as it compares to 5 or 6 other competing similar companies of a similar profile. So establish their case rates per year, then establish the substantiation rates, the type of cases they get in proportion. So generally and conventionally, more HR employee-based concerns. I know the board or certainly more compliance programs are interested in, the business integrity kind of proportion, and then the substantiation rate of those. Recently, we've seen more of a trend in the higher rates of sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. And again, that's a demonstration of trust, I think, and culture. These are coming through, and then the substantiation rate, that's a good reflection. So I've done a combination of everything that Rachel's done, but then also established some formal and informal network groups in combination with just looking at people's sustainability reports, if they have those basic statistics contained, and actually just reaching out to my peers and colleagues and saying, look, I'll share with you our basic statistics. There's nothing confidential around that. And then that as a means to establish like-for-like comparators to the board, I found that was very successful in our very pointed and specific investigations program effectiveness paper. And that had all the elements that I've discussed today with a direct comparator. And that just showed, this program is good. And we framed it in as if I was asking the questions. So what do you do about this? This is what we've done. How does this work? Well, this is how this works. So it just made it an interesting, practical example that I'd like to give on how to present that to your senior management, and that displayed the return on investment. Okay, this is working. We get the value and the insights that's coming from it. So one takeaway from me is, if you don't ask, you don't get. So I just called everyone and said, "What's your statistics?" Various heads of investigations. I just got on the phone to them. So that seemed to work for me.
Thanks, Manu. Annabel, anything to add?
No, I think Rachel and Manu have been pretty comprehensive. The one thought I had was one thing you could do is commission your own research. There are agencies out there that do that in a very kind of scientific and academic way. And you could do that as an organisation, or do that, via an industry peer group.
Thank you. Time's moving on. I should just take this opportunity to just mention the 2021 whistleblowing report that EQS published. It was launched, you may have seen it just before this event, and you've mentioned external surveys and reports, and although whistleblowing is just one aspect of a compliance program, reports such as that are really helpful in terms of getting benchmark data that you can compare your performance again, and that's available free of charge, can be downloaded from the EQS website. Time is moving on. We've got about 15 minutes left in our allotted time, so I'd like to ask one final question before we move into questions from the audience. And this is specifically around investigations. We talked more broadly about compliance, and we've talked about investigations. But how can you help ensure that your investigations are effective and efficient, and that you can demonstrate, the return on investment or the return on investigation when reporting to your board? Manu, perhaps one for you to start with.
Yeah, I think a lot of things I've been trying to progress in investigations program management perspective is getting back to basics and into the detail of the conduct of investigations. So breaking this down further, how can you say that your investigation is effective if you're not necessarily relying on substantiation as the only measure? Well, again, I'll bring this down to that governance, that review, taking steps. Specifically that I've done is tracking plan versus execution, and then how that leads to an outcome. Because quite simply, if you've listed and identified in your planning stage these actions, because that's what you've assessed, that's what you planned, and yet they're not carried out, how can you reasonably say that the outcome would have been different, or the way it could have been, had you not executed on these plans? So checking people's expenses, doing all the other things that might have been done. I mean, investigations are very fluid, but as a means to check the effectiveness of an investigation, you have to have that oversight. You have to look at plan versus execution. And that's when you can then have more confidence and assurance that our activities, we've actually done what we've said we would do. And the investigations is not just a black box that no one looks in and we just rely on the outcomes. I think as much as anything, it's about that trust and that transparency. And I think that's how you can also report out to your board and say, look, we have absolute transparency. We have a 30, 60, 90-day check-in process, which is what I've instilled. And within that, we check plan versus task, and then we can get to an outcome. So I think that's something that is a way to measure and demonstrate effectiveness. And that becomes a KPI. You know, how many reports from a management point of view have had the 90-day check? And therefore, why are we at 90 days for this investigation? Do they need support? Have all the plans been executed? And that then drives your performance. And I found that also draws down the aging time. So again, it goes back to that effectiveness measure. It's a combination of substantiation, the aging, and that reporter engagement. That really helps demonstrate that your investigations process is effective.
Thanks, Manu. Annabel, we turn to you next.
Yeah, so I completely agree with everything Manu said, but just taking a step back before you get to that point in the process of investigating, there are kind of three things that I would look at in terms of efficiency. The first would be around having a really rigorous triage process. So, you know, there are going to be some that you're not going to investigate at all. There are going to be some that you, the building in a proportionality assessment here, some that are going to be a lighter touch investigation, and some that are going to be a really thorough, detailed investigation. So you've got to have that, you know, really in place. And then the other thing is around really rigorous scoping and planning. So, you know, scope what you're going to do, plan how you're going to do it, and stick to that unless there are good reasons to veer from that. And I think that will set you up for an extremely efficient investigation team and process.
Thanks, Annabel. And Rachel, should we turn to you?
I don't really have anything to add. I think they've covered it. Yeah.
Great. So those were all the questions that I had for each of you. I think there's some really interesting points that came out of that. There's been quite a few questions come in from the audience. So in the time remaining for us, let's try and deal with as many of those as we can. So the first one is, how does a compliance program interact with other layers in the organization to achieve effectiveness? Layers such as risk management or internal audit may have close responsibilities. How does this interaction affect the conduct of investigations and the subsequent reporting to the board? Who would like to pick that one up?
I could pick it up from just an overall interaction rather than investigative. I think it's very important, you know, if you take the three line of defense, you know, the management are the first line, and compliance are the second line, and then internal audit. In terms of scoping an internal audit plan, I like to have sight of what's been done by compliance and what are they uncovering, you know, and the same with risk. It feeds into, you know, if compliance are uncovering a number of issues in a particular area, it feeds into the risk profile of the overall business. And so I think it's totally appropriate that there is interaction between those three areas. And again, communication is just so important in terms of compliance, having the ear of management and being able to show that it's an important thing, that it's of strategic importance, that they can demonstrate that, you know, by being compliant, it you know, adds value in terms of allowing us to partner with people, or you know, being able to sell our business, that people are comfortable dealing with us. From an investigations point of view, maybe Manu or Annabel would like to jump in.
I've got some thoughts actually, if you don't mind me going first, Manu. So interestingly, I was actually on some training yesterday on whistleblowing, and we had some poll questions. And the first one was, we asked, in your organisation, where does your investigations function sit? And one of the options was, is it completely independent from legal, compliance, HR, everything else? And the answer was about 10%. And then the follow-up question was, where should it sit? And about 60% of people said it should be completely independent. So I think that's a really interesting contrast. I totally agree, Rachel, that there should be communication between all the functions. But I think it's really important in terms of both being and being perceived to be independent is really fundamental for building trust in your whistleblowing program and your investigations program.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with that. I think that in my experience, some of the better positioned investigations programs and whistleblowing programs sit outside of those functions, generally more from an ethics, integrity or compliance space. But to be a bit more specific on how your investigations or compliance program can connect with other parts of your business or your organization, something very specific that again I've introduced and made it a task and KPI almost for the investigations team was to track the corrective and preventative actions that have come out of an investigation, and how do we feed that into the organization as a means to show that as a result of an investigation we have changed the process and established or identified a risk area that no one knew existed or was not being tracked anyway. And the way we did that was organizations may have various tools where they track and measure their risk taxonomy. These are the areas in the business, this is the risk taxonomy, and this is how we're tracking. So what I did, I made it a specific action to upload and enter any risk area that an investigation discovered or that it speaks to, and then enter the corrective action. And that would be a task for audit to then come in and check if that organization or business unit has actually then carried through and changed that course of action, changed that process and control. And then it becomes a means to help join up the organization, audit, compliance and legal. The investigations come away from that and saying, well, not we solved the problem, but a reporter or an issue was created, developed, it was investigated, it exposed these risk areas, you have a process and control that needs to be fixed or corrected, enter it on your risk tracking system and platform. There's various tools out there that can do that. And then it's tangible, it's substantive, it's not anecdotal, it's report, concern, investigation, outcome, process corrective. And I think that's how you really get granular and create these processes, and that gets all these teams talking to each other. I found that was a really good way of embedding the responsibilities of all these functions, ultimately to show that we found something wrong and we've corrected it, and now it's not going to happen again.
Thanks, Manu. Excuse me. We've got about 5 minutes left, and there's a few other questions I'd like to get through. The next one is, how can you practically change perceptions of the compliance function from being perceived as policing rather than an enabling function? Rachel?
I think that's a challenge. I always say it's a challenge for internal audit, how to be seen, not just as tick box, and I think it's being involved in conversations early. If it needs to be more of a strategic function and it needs to be recognized as such, it's a hard one to win over people. But even the carrot and stick approach, in terms of saying, what if we don't do this right, we could be subject to fines of X, Y, and Z, or we could get, the attention of the regulator, or the board has specifically asked us to look at this. But then the carrot is, again, if we're doing it well, you could have a competitive advantage. You could look for some, external certification to show that you maintain high security standards, etc. And that could make people more willing to partner with you or to work with you. So that would be my reply.
Anything to add?
No.
I've spoken about this before actually on a different forum, and I've raised a few eyebrows, but I think, and forgive us if anyone's heard this before, but what are you trying to achieve? You're trying to actually get people to change their behavior and get to change how they see you. Well, there's other organizations or other industries that focus on that. It's marketing. All you need to do is improve your marketing and your campaign and your look and feel, your brand. And I think if you can do that, if you can make it fun, engaging, interesting. You know, this is the age of, you know, your Instagram, your TikTok. No one wants to read 50 pages, 10 pages. They want short, sharp infographics, information, videos that are engaging. And, you know, there's lots of support out there, lots of organizations who are adopting that methodology. And I think the more and more compliance gets its gears into that train of thought, you know, it's about changing minds and perceptions. You can't do the same thing and expect a different result. So I think marketing is your main kind of aim here. Rebrand, engage, that will do it. And it works, believe me, it absolutely works.
I think we've got time for one, possibly two more questions. The next one is, in your view, which characteristics and features are particularly critical to the success of corporate compliance programs? So what are the key success factors? I think we touched on some of this earlier, but anything you particularly highlight?
So I'll kick off if you don't mind. I think that I'm hearing the phrase more and more compliance around streamlining and low friction. So I think that one of the best ways is to really think, you know, you go through what needs to be done and the laws and the regulations, and then you come up with the process. But then before you then roll that out to business, maybe socialize it with a couple of people in the business first and work together on how you can still achieve what needs to be achieved by law and regulation, but in a way that feels less tick box and less, you know, less potentially causing friction in the day-to-day BAU of the business.
Yeah, I think it's got to be agile as well. It's got to react to those changing circumstances. This sounds like, you know, quite everyday normal stuff, but, you know, it's got to be locally relevant, particularly if you've got a decentralized or localized kind of environment. You know, globally applicable, but locally relevant. It has to speak to those environments. It's got to work for them as well. And I think it is all about the compromise. There might be some, you know, some red lines you can't cross, but I think how you engage, how you get this across to people, and exactly how Annabel says, it's delivering it in a way that they can understand and digest and apply with the low friction. I like that low friction.
Rachel, I think yours is the last word.
I agree with what the others have said. And definitely, I think compliance has an important role in contributing to the overall success of the company. You need to have management's ear and be able to show that your work matters to the outcomes for the company.
Great. We're out of time, just about, unfortunately, so there's no time to answer any further questions, but I think we've managed to cover many of the key points that have been raised. So I think from my side, all that remains for me is to thank our three panelists, Manu, Annabel, and Rachel, for what I think has been a really interesting contribution, really interesting discussion, and some good topics have come out during today. Apologies that we didn't get to all of the questions. I'm sure, you know, the panelists would be happy to reach out to them on LinkedIn or other methods if you have other things you'd like to discuss with them. But thanks for participating in this particular session and for the questions you've submitted. I hope you found the discussion helpful, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the ECEC event. Okay, many thanks, everybody. It's nice to present to you. Thanks, Nan.
Thank you. Cheers, Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks.